Let's not waste any time. Another Ming offensive is about to begin. Leo Big Sword Ting had been on the move south towards the western side of the Japanese defensive line, with close to 22,000 men, with the Korean Commander-in-Chief Gwon Yul and the Minister of the Right Yi Da-kyung. Their army was close to 6,000. The fortress that they would soon be attacking was held by none other than Konishi Yukinaga, and it was on the southern coast of Chola province, just a few kilometers past the town of Suncheon. The fortress itself was very well constructed. Stone and earthen walls had been made carefully so that the defenders would have a clear field of view for their matchlock men and archers. And on top of this was a large moat surrounding it filled with seawater. It also had an estimated 13,000 men to defend it, and some 400 to 500 ships waiting to evacuate the Japanese army the second that they got the permission to do so. The Minister of the Right, Yi Da-kyung, did not seem to have a high opinion of the Ming commander, and thought that Liu Ting was actually hesitant to attack, and was purposely slowing his advance. He is said to have stopped several times to have ceremonies and have his and the Korean officers sign oaths to obey all orders given. When the Allied army finally reached near enough to see Konishi Yukinaga's fortress, Liu Ting's force was approached with a messenger holding a letter asking for the Ming commander to meet with Konishi for negotiations. Ting was of course thrilled. A letter was sent back agreeing, something that alarmed the Koreans. Liu Ting told them that this was simply a ploy to lure Konishi out so that they could capture him though. Not to worry. Around this same time, contact between Liu Ting and the naval forces under Yi Sun-sin and the Ming naval commander Chen Lin was established. A plan was then drawn up to have both forces attack at the same time, one from sea and one from land. The attack began on the 19th of October, which was the same time that the negotiations were supposed to begin. Liu Ting had a stand-in disguised as himself and then sent the man towards the Japanese fortress with the Allied army at his rear. And it seems like their plan was working. Konishi had his gates wide open and was walking out of it. Now what happened next is kind of up for debate, as there's three different accounts. One has Liu Ting's troops launching a signal rocket too early, alerting Konishi that this was a trap. The second has that Konishi Yukinaga was already suspicious once he reached the meeting area. A pigeon was then released by the Ming side too early, which signaled the Eastern Route Army to shoot at the Japanese army and ruin the plan. The third account says that one of Liu Ting's company commanders was ethnically Japanese and leaked the plan out to Konishi Yukinaga. Whether none or one of these accounts are correct hardly matters though, as Konishi was once again back behind the safety of the fortress walls. The Ming general's plan had failed. Now they would either have to lay siege or take it by force. They chose force. For the next 3 days, the Korean and Ming Allied Navy fired their cannons at the Japanese fortress. In the morning, they would advance with the tide, and in the evening, they would withdraw with the tide as it left. This was incredibly dangerous, and not something that I would expect an inexperienced naval commander to be able to pull off. After all, these ships had to get very close to the fortress where the waters just weren't as deep. Not only that, but using the tides to move the ships back and forth had the potential to beach the ships. Luckily for the Allied Navy, Yi Sun-sin was the one coordinating it. For these bombardments to be successful, the Navy would need the land-based forces to put pressure on the fortress. This wasn't being done. Liu Ting was busy having his men build siege engines instead. What this meant was that the Allied naval forces got close enough to fire their cannons, but also then came under fire from the Japanese wall guns, matchlocks, and hand cannons. After October 21st, the Allied Navy gave up these attacks and pulled its ships back to safety and waited for Liu Ting to attack. Liu Ting's men worked on their siege engines for over a week. On October 30th, they completed them and they were finally ready. The Ming naval commander Chen Lin went ashore that same day and met with Liu Ting to coordinate their attacks. The assault would begin the next day on the 31st. That morning at 6 a.m., the Allied Navy used the tide once again to get them within range of the fortress. The Allied Navy was incredibly confident that they would be successful, as they had recently been joined by 100 additional Ming ships. This assault lasted for 6 hours. Yi Sun-sin estimated that at this time that they must have caused significant losses on the Japanese side, but also recognized that they themselves were starting to take on casualties. They were finally forced to pull back early in the afternoon. On the other side of the fortress, the Allied armies were having major problems. Liu Ting sent out a wave of men to attack, but they were unable to make it past a wooden barricade that encircled the front of the fortress. The second that they reached it, matchlock fire cut into them, then completely drove them back by a Japanese force that had left out of one of the gates. A second Ming force was also sent in, but they were also pushed back. Liu Ting then decided that another push was needed, so he personally led a third wave. This too was pushed back. The Japanese guns and the ground units were just too much. Some of the Ming siege engines were also proving to be utterly useless. They were heavy, hard to move, and when they did get them into position, the Japanese would simply concentrate their matchlock fire upon them. The men pushing these siege engines then were forced to hide behind them, otherwise they would be shot. The day ended with failure for the Allied side. This of course did not mean that they would stop now. Instead, Liu Ting sent messages to Yi Sun-sin and Chen Lin to have the ships attack again. This time, they moved their ships in close with the evening tide. Under the darkness, they were able to sink several ships anchored there and then bombard the fortress once again. Konishi Yukinaga, it seems, had been smart enough to have the ships needed to evacuate hidden in nearby inlets before the siege began, though. After a while, Yi Sun-sin noticed that the tide was starting to turn. If they did not leave soon, their ships ran a real risk of being run aground. Yi then commanded his ships to head for deeper waters and waited for Chen Lin and the rest of the Ming ships to follow. They didn't, though, causing the Korean naval commander to become quite concerned. He then had a message sent out to the flagship of Chen Lin to pull his ships back while there was still enough time. Now, for whatever reason, Chen Lin decided not to move his ships. 39 Ming ships then became trapped by shallow waters and couldn't escape. The Japanese saw this, and the call came out. The enemy is trying to land troops. They didn't know that this was not done on purpose. Either way, the Japanese left out of the fortress to attack the ships head on. The fighting that ensued would only be described as desperate and fierce. Yi Sun-sin saw all this from his flagship and gave the command to have some of his ships fire their cannons at the attacking Japanese as they left the fortress. The Japanese, under both cannon fire and having to fight the Ming, realized that the situation did not favor them, and they retreated back into their fortress. What was left of the Ming force was then saved. The Ming ships, however, were burned, with the exception of 5 vessels that were kept. 2 of these ships were actually sent back to Japan after all this and kept as a local attraction in Osaka. On the other side of the fortress, fighting had completely died out. You see, earlier in the day, Liu Ting had received a dispatch letting him know of Dong Yiyuan's defeat at Sachon in the east. This made the Sichuan general incredibly nervous, and the news discouraged him completely. Something the Korean commanders noticed. Their worst fears were confirmed when a Korean captive could be heard shouting behind the walls. All their soldiers are fighting on the other side. Attack now while there's a chance. Hearing this, Korean Commander-in-Chief Gwon Yul and the other officials urged Liu Ting to seize the moment and attack. The Ming general refused. Liu Ting wanted to retreat. On November 2nd, Yi Sun-sin led a naval bombardment of the fortress, but there was no further attacks from Liu Ting. And Chen Lin didn't seem like he engaged much either. After a few hours, Yi Sun-sin called off this attack. 2 days later, after waiting to see what his allies would do, Yi received a message that the Ming camp had been broken down and that they were falling back to the northern town of Suncheon. In the haste to leave, the Ming had actually left their supplies unburned, which the Japanese did gladly take, something that angered the Korean government minister Yi Da-kyung, who had been so hard-pressed to obtain said supplies. The Allied Navy also fell back, as there was no hope of them being successful by themselves. This was the end of the battle. It wasn't the only one, though. A while back, Magoi had committed himself to laying siege to Kato Kiyomasa's Dosan fortress in Ulsan once again. On November 2nd, the same day, Magoi, after receiving a dispatch alerting him of the defeat at Sachon, called off the siege. He then took his troops to Gyeongju and then set up his new headquarters at a small town called Sinwon. This ended the long, hard-fought Battle of Suncheon, as well as ended the Second Siege of Ulsan. After a string of failures, I'll cover how the Ming Emperor reacted to all this, as well as the Japanese commanders finally hearing about Toyotomi Hideyoshi's death. I'll see you next time.